My duder, what's up?
Hi. Okay, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Okay, give me 1 second to finish scuffing this up. Like I'm fixing how it looks on my
Is this
screen.
the "you're
No
not wrong,
problem.
you're just an asshole" arc? I hope things get
Okay.
better, buddy.
So
Maybe
how's
you
your
should
day
value
been?
friendships higher in your quest for
My
best
day's been
personal
great.
happy
I've
good
just been
luck.
talking to people about
Beautiful.
everything that's going on. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to I'm still like learning how to do all this stuff, but okay,
No
I think we're
problemo.
good. Okay. So if you want to turn on your camera, that'd be cool. If not, that's okay. Up to you.
Jesus. Wait, are you streaming?
Yeah, I am.
Wait, you have camera on stream and on Discord? Wait, are you
Yeah, I
streaming?
figured out how to how to basically do it.
Oh wait, hold on. Is this like the whole cheat code? Hold on, hold on. I got the whole argument right here. Let me read this real quick.
Wait, no, not everything. Ah, it's kind of scuffed. Okay, I'm just like I kind of put some
Holy
basic
Jesus
things I want to go
Christ.
over.
You were gonna send me
Yeah.
this beforehand? You were just gonna ambush me with a fucking PowerPoint?
Do you want to read it beforehand?
No, it's all good. Don't worry. I'm used to it at this point. Alright. Hold on. Wait, do you stream in a fucking closet? Or is this your room?
No, this is my room. I live in a small dorm right now. Yeah, it's really tiny. I told you.
Gotcha. Okay.
It's actually smaller than my New York apartment, which is like quite tragic because Florida's supposed to have more space.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I got really nervous, so I started just writing notes down, and I was like, okay, I'll share them and stuff, because like I just like want to make sure that I go over everything. You see, it's not even done. But yeah, so before we start, I keep scrolling up and down. I just wanted to go over some basic points, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
So even though I don't agree with egoism, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to like, try to argue like through your
Within that
perspective.
framework, sure.
Yeah, within that framework, exactly. So like, correct me if I'm wrong. I just like, I was just writing all of this down to get my thoughts out.
Mm-hmm.
So as like a society, as like an egoist, right? In the long term, you do want society to get better and to thrive because that benefits you, right?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, right. So because of this, we should like try to eliminate like unfair treatments of minorities or like oppressed peoples, because when you have like this unfair treatment, it leads to like marginalization, and it leads to like things like more crime, less opportunities, and in the long run, that hurts you, right?
I agree with this, but of course what qualifies as mistreatment or whatever is gonna be like a heavily contested part of that premise. But yeah, of course, I would agree.
Yes. Okay. So if we want to achieve this end goal, we should like, try to do whatever we can to combat these systems of oppression.
As long as the combating them doesn't cause like there's still like a calculus there. It can't cause like a great harm to ourselves. So like
Okay.
theoretically, let's say for instance we could make 10 minority people much happier if we killed ourselves. That would be like an unacceptable trade. That's an extreme example, but like as an example, right?
Okay. Okay, that makes sense.
Okay.
Okay. So I just like wanted to go over like, dehumanization and stuff like that quickly, like before like, jumping into like the N-word stuff,
Mm-hmm.
because this is like my perspective from things, right?
Sure.
And I honestly I have like a whole link filled with like tabs and stuff of like studies that I can put later. But I was like, okay, I just want to like not like a band-aid, but I guess kind of like a band-aid. I was like, I'm so nervous, I'm just gonna go for it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm pretty sure like what dehumanization is. I'm just gonna go over this for like people on chat who are just like who don't necessarily like know or don't have the full definition,
Okay.
and also so we have like the same definitions. So like the definition I'm working here is dehumanization is like the process of like depriving a person or a group of persons, a group of people from like positive qualities, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we're trying like, people in general have human characteristics. Dehumanization is like creating this other, creating like this different thing, right? Trying to like make them not human anymore or make their view like less than you, kind
Or
of.
at the very least, like making them feel excluded from like what is normal or whatever, right? Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And then when it comes to like racial slurs, like the whole point of like a racial slur, I would argue, is that you're trying to like exclude and demean others on a basis of race, ethnicity, or nationality.
Do I agree with this? Generally, yeah. Or at the very least, like at the outset of a racial slur, like it's probably its unintended consequence that it serves to otherize people or make them feel like they're not part of whatever group you're a part of. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so then we go to the beginning, the real beginning.
Okay.
So I would argue that the reason why you shouldn't use the N-word in private is
Wait, okay, hold on. Just real quick for my own sanity.
Mm-hmm.
Can we just say like edgy or like edgy jokes or racial slurs in general? Because it always gets refocused on literally just the N-word, unless that's literally the only thing you want to argue, and it's up to you, I guess.
Oh no, I'm talking about like there's very few exceptions.
Mm-hmm.
I was gonna write it here, but then I wasn't sure. For me, like when I'm talking about the exceptions, like obviously, like if you're gonna quote something,
yeah, of course,
right?
of course.
Yeah, like quoting.
But I just mean the arguments you're making right now probably aren't going to be exclusive to the N-word. It's going to be to all racial slurs, I would imagine.
Yes, but
okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right, gotcha.
Yeah, it was just since like the whole like topic before and like put N-word, but really it's about racial slurs in general as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I guess like also we can limit this conversation for like edgy jokes or just just used in private.
Sure.
So yeah, I'm saying like you shouldn't use it because it is a dehumanizing word, right? Like culturally and historically, it's been used to like demean and otherize people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what I kind of understood from our earlier like talks and stuff like that is that, oh no, but I'm using it like as a joke, right? I'm using it as something for shock factor. Correct me if I'm wrong at any point in time, by the way.
Yep.
So therefore, because I'm using it as like a shock factor sort of thing, I'm not actually being racist because I don't actually like believe this stuff, right?
Okay.
Am I wrong? Like, is that what your argument is in general, or your belief, or?
Okay, so being very specific, I think it is. So yeah. So restating what you're saying, a person could theoretically use a slur and it not necessarily have a harmful effect to society or the marginalized group that it is originally about. Would be like the rephrase way. Is that right? Did you lose anything, or did I lose anything there from what you were saying, or does that about encompass it?
I think I understand, but we'll find out. We'll find out soon if I didn't.
Okay.
So here's the thing, right? Yeah, jokes like these can be the counter to that thing, or my rebuttal. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Rebuttal. Is that even though it might seem like that in the surface area, right? The thing is, there's something like, people have implicit and subconscious bias. And like there's like studies about that, just in case you want me to like back up what I'm saying. But people in general suffer from subconscious bias, and you can see it like in a large scale when it comes to society and like how we treat marginalized groups of people. So even though these jokes at the surface level might seem like, oh, it's just the shock factor thing, the continuation of these jokes like can reinforce those subconscious biases, which then leads to real world discrimination. Does that make sense? Do you agree? Do you disagree with anything?
It could. So this might be where the entire disagreement rests, I guess. So, well, it'll depend on how much you push back against this. So I absolutely would have to agree that engaging in some forms of racial humor in some people could definitely reinforce an implicit bias, or possibly even create one that didn't exist prior to that. So for instance, I believe that if you spend a lot of time on like 4chan and they're constantly making jokes about black people or Indian people, that those are things that are almost likely to show up in like your actual evaluation of these people. That's something that I can agree with. I think you agree with that, right?
Yes.
So however, what I would say is that I do believe that it is possible to reach a level of cognition related to these types of humor that you could engage with them without them necessarily causing implicit biases to form. So for instance, that like I really don't like to use myself as an example, but if I were to use myself as an example, I would say that like I am very aware of all of the backgrounds relating to why slurs are bad, why things are harmful, what harmful effects on society minorities deal with, et cetera, et cetera. So like I can engage with certain forms of humor, and I would argue that anybody with that prerequisite background could engage with certain forms of humor and not cause like these subconscious unintended things to form because they're kind of like aware that they could. That would be the long form of that. Is there a part of that you might disagree with, or we can move from there? Okay, yeah, go for it.
Because this is a thing. Even like, and I guess like it goes back to like ideal versus practical world, right?
Sure.
I don't think, and I can like find studies to link you just in case, like for backing up or whatever. There's a lot of people in this world who don't believe they have any subconscious bias. Who like, if you ask them, it's like me, sexist, never. Me, racist, never. However, when it comes like to, I don't know, like I don't know how to describe the exact test. I forgot the exact name. But when it comes to like tests that I guess revealed like these subconscious biases, they do come back like positive for it, right? So I guess like the only way I'd be able to agree with you when it comes to that is that you would literally have to take like a series of like, scientifically valid subconscious testing to see if that's true or not. Because until you figure that out, you really don't know like how much these jokes might affect your like subconscious bias. So you can take a person who never says the N-word, who actually goes to rallies for minorities, who like is very vocal about their support, and they can still have racial like subconscious bias. The whole point of it is that because it's subconscious, we'll never truly know unless if you theoretically take like a series of tests to figure it out. So until that's determined, it's kind of like better to be safe than sorry, Do
you think that it's so here's so I'm going to bring this up and then we can kind of move from there. When you say something like it's better to be safe than sorry, it feels like a lot of the times people don't acknowledge that there is a harm that's committed when you've lost access to certain forms of humor. Now, when I use the word harm there, I mean it in a very literal way, like something bad is happening or whatever. Not like you're physically harmed or you're getting sick or going to the hospital or whatever, but that like basically like losing access to some pleasurable things can be seen as like a form of harm. You'd call it like I think, what do you mean? Fuck, I don't know the name for it. There's a specific name for this, but like taking away something that like somebody might like would be like considered like a form of harm. I only bring that back up in response to the, because oftentimes people will say things like, there's no reason for this, or like we should do, I think what you said was like we should do anything possible to avoid some given thing. And that's something that I don't necessarily agree with. We shouldn't do anything possible, assuming there is like some harm. There's like a kind of a calculation you've got to perform there. Like what are you losing and what are you gaining, right?
Okay.
So I just wanted to make sure that was understood. So one question that I would kind of ask is, let's say if you could take two people that were functionally the same in society. So they treated minorities the same, they voted the same, they did everything functionally the same, but maybe inside in their head, maybe they harbor some implicit bias, but like when it comes up, they're kind of aware of it. And they kind of try to check against it, that if these two people existed, do you think there's like a meaningful difference between these two people?
Well, yeah, I do think there's a meaningful difference. And the reason why I say that, and I guess like, you bring up the whole thing of like, oh, what if they can check their subconscious bias? But I feel like that sentence
negative
itself
punishment
is not very realistic or practical, because the whole point of subconscious bias is that you kind of don't realize it, right?
Well,
like nobody.
You can kind of realize. So the way that you would realize like a subconscious bias is that you would basically try to like check your actions. Are you familiar with like the cognitive behavioral therapy model? Have you ever heard of this? So basically, the idea is that like we can have some emotions or whatever, or some thoughts, I guess, and those can happen kind of without our control, but we can choose how we respond to them. So like, I think it's possible that I could understand that I have some subconscious aversion to something, but still be able to like manage my response to said thing. So for instance, like, let's say for instance, I had a subconscious aversion to heights, I think it would be possible for me to, even though I have that response, like realize, okay, hold on, I'm having this response. It's really bad. Like I don't have to like respond in this way, right?
Yeah, but then it goes back to two things, right? When you make jokes like these, even if you yourself, let's say, can check your subconscious bias, it doesn't necessarily mean that other people can, right? Like, no matter how badly we want, like, we're not mind readers. We can't tell, like, how much subconscious bias a person has, or if they even recognize that they have any, or if they are constantly checking against it, right? So I guess, like, that's where, like, another point of, like, contention comes from. That even if...
Oh, yeah, go ahead, finish.
Yeah.
Or that even if we thought we could do it ourselves, we can't, like, validate, like, our friends or whatever, basically, right?
Yeah.
So the thing that I think is kind of weird about this, or that I don't necessarily like about this, is that I do think that we have some sort of understanding of what's in other people's heads. Like, even if we can't know for sure, we kind of have to function on a day-to-day basis that we can have a reasonably certain understanding of what's going on in, like, the minds of our friends or the people around us. So, like, for example, like, theoretically, like, you know, any guy, if he were to like knock me out with a drug, could like do horrible things to a person's body. Like that could always happen. But like when we go to the doctor or we go to the dentist or whatever, like these people have been are hopefully not going to do that, right? Like we trust them to some extent to practice in responsible ways what they're doing. And I feel like you can make like similar arguments to that to like friend groups. Like you have friends that you're reasonably certain that they'll respond in certain ways, or you're reasonably certain they have certain ideas or political beliefs. So like a black person might be friends with a white person and he's like reasonably certain that guy's not racist. Now he can't truly ever know, but I don't think we would like live in a way where it's like, well, we can't know the thoughts of anybody around us. I think that feels a little extreme to me.
Well, that's the thing. We can, we can kind of like categorize and, somewhat like determine, right, what people's thoughts are. So generally, like if a person's like, I love a mint chip ice cream. Mint chip ice cream is the best, right? You can like categorize that thought and be like, okay, like I know that about this person. But the thing is like, when it comes to like things that are subconscious, things that are in like the deeper level of the mind that don't always come out until like we have like blind studies and things like that, where we actually see like these like consistent patterns. Until we have that data, it's really not knowable. So I'm not saying you can't know anything about your friends, really. That's not what I'm conveying, or I'm not trying to convey that. I'm just saying that in things that focus on like marginalized and oppressed groups, you're basically like taking a really big gamble and risk. And as you said before, like, oh, there's a calculation you have to do there, right? If we stop making these jokes, like people like lose humor, which is something that they appreciate and like, have fun with. But I would argue that, even like that small loss of humor, which you can find humor in many different things, is nothing compared to the possibility of continuing to reinforce these oppressive structures that many people face with and deal with on a day-to-day basis.
So I can understand your argument there. The biggest strength of my argument, I think, is that I have like a pretty clear line where I can say like, this is what I accept as being responsible. And then I'm going to like, this is where I'm going to draw the line on this thing here. Like in a private setting with people you can reasonably trust, I think that you can make certain types of jokes, and that's the end of that. I'm okay because that brings the discussion, in my opinion, that brings the discussion completely to a close. So the thing that scares me, or the thing that I don't like about the position, the positive position that you present, is I feel like if I were to run that down to its logical conclusion, we get to a lot of very strange areas. So let me give you an example. So tell me if I say something you disagree with. It's possible that maybe there's like a certain slur that I could use, and even if I use it in an okay context, somebody could hear it, and upon hearing that slur, it kind of sort of like implicitly reinforces a stereotype they might have of a certain group of people just because they hear the slur. Like that's like an okay kind of summary of what you're saying, right?
Yeah.
So like using this argument, couldn't I like pretty reasonably argue that all black people shouldn't be allowed to say the N-word in any rap song ever because rap is something that's enjoyed at large by white people?
Okay, so this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, right? That assumes that like when a black person says the N-word, it means the same thing as when a white person says the N-word. And I would argue that because of historical context and connotation and just like yeah, just like the whole history behind them. The N-word itself takes on a very different meaning when a Black person says it than versus a white person says it, right?
Yeah, so I agree with you 100%. I have to. That's a very reasonable response. However, if we can't even trust people to know if they're starting to foster racist attitudes towards people because they can't even evaluate that of themselves, is it really reasonable to expect the average white person to understand the historical context and the implications and the difference between a Black person using the N-word versus the white person? It seems like if our threshold for trusting people to audit their thoughts is incredibly low, it seems strange that we would trust them to understand the difference of the nature of the N-word used by a white person or a Black person, no?
I understand where you're coming from, and my response is kind of like a hot take in this situation, I guess.
Sure.
So that's why, like, for me, ideally and practically, yeah, I would rather have nobody say the N-word, right? However, we have to acknowledge that for a lot of these people, like, reclaiming this word and being able to like use it after so many years of just it being used like discriminatorily is a form of kind of counteracting like these oppressive systems. And who am I to tell them like, oh no, like that you shouldn't counteract your oppressive system by doing this?
Do we really think that when like Jay-Z or Nas or somebody would like uses the N-word in a rap song, like is that really like contributing to a culture that's like counteracting like racism against Black people? Like is that really like a necessary part of their act? Like wouldn't they more or less be able to get the message across just the same without having to resort to using a slur that like white people might misinterpret as well, the N-word is okay, or Black people call themselves the N-word, so they must accept that they're barely human or whatever? Like
it's certainly possible. However, it's like, give me a second, like this is gonna sound really weird.
Yeah, that's fine.
But historically speaking, like we've seen it used in we've seen this type of strategy used in other places, like for example gay people calling themselves the F word, or women calling themselves bitches, right? Like, oh, I'm a bad bitch.
Sure. So like not to I'm going to use a personal example here, and I'm going to say that it happens to a lot of people. You can reject that if you want, but like for me, one of the reasons why it was so hard for me to get off saying the F word is because I actually had 2 or 3 pretty close gay friends growing up. And they told me that it was really cool to say it because they said it. Not that it was really cool, but that it was okay. So that actually hampered my ability to understand why it was hurtful in a larger platform, because gay people told me that it was cool to say it. And I know that there are a lot of other straight people that have those experiences as well, where they have like a gay friend that's like, oh, no, dude, it's actually cool. So I feel like if anything, that makes things even more confusing.
Well,
sometimes.
That's the thing, right? Like, you're right, that can make things more confusing, right? Like, no minority is like a monolith, right? Like,
of course,
different people are gonna have different opinions. However, what we should focus on, or I feel like what we should focus on is the fact that since we're not in those oppressive structures, and since like we have like technically benefited from those oppressive structures, we should do like at least our own part or our best part to try to tear them down, right?
Sure.
So yeah, we can go into like a whole discussion of like, well, and should Black people really say it or not, or should gay people really say it or not? But I guess I would argue that's not necessarily for us to decide, since we're not in that oppressive stance.
Well, sure. So it might not be for us to decide, but we can make a statement on whether or not we agree on it. And also, by the way, your position, and in case you think it sounds crazy, the idea that, well, Black people shouldn't be able to say the N-word, that's not that crazy of a position. There are like people, and even in the Black community, that do believe that. So like that's a valid out. Like if you want to take that route. But it does seem to me that like when you begin to make the argument that like certain groups of people can use certain slurs because it's either part of a more complicated process to like reclaim them or to empower themselves, that in order to understand that argument might even be more complicated than understanding that if you say a racial slur, you shouldn't let it reinforce, some implicit bias, is all I'm saying, basically. That like if a person has the wherewithal, the understanding to know that, well, when a Black person uses a slur, it's not being racist against them. I'm not going to let that reinforce anything subliminally. Well, then they should be able to say it themselves, understanding that it shouldn't reinforce anything subliminally. Like both of those things are like pretty like high level thought processes, in my opinion.
But okay, this is like, I guess this is where it kind of goes back to a circle, right?
Sure.
Because like the whole point of like subliminal is that it's kind of out of our control. And even though you do make like a good point about, oh yeah, if you have like such like you know, higher the normal thought processes about this, then you're going to be more inclined, or like it's going to be easier for you to like fight against them. At the end of the day, like it's still not a guarantee, right?
Yeah,
And
but
the
also it's
question-
not a guarantee that there aren't white people that hear black people use the N-word in songs that don't think that, like, wow, even black people think they're N-words. Like, geez, of course I'm right when I say it. That's definitely, I know for a fact that there are some white people that have heard rap songs that come away with those thoughts. Very racist white people that will do that. So, like, it seems like it's easier to just say, like, nobody should say any slurs at all. Gay people shouldn't call themselves F-words. Black people can't call themselves N-words. Like, that's the path you'd have to run down, basically.
Yeah, but what I'm saying is, like, you know, I guess, like, I'm not sure if I'm conveying myself clearly enough right now.
Sure. Or I might not be understanding. It's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah. For me, in an ideal world, yeah, people wouldn't use slurs, right?
Sure.
In a practical world, though, like, if people are using it as a way to basically say fuck you to the oppressive structures that they're in, since I am not in that oppressive structure, I feel like I have no real say to be like, oh yeah, you should or you shouldn't say it, or to police their own language.
Sure.
However, like, what I can say is that we know that it's dehumanizing when white people use it. We know that just like generally it's dehumanizing.
It can lead to having dehumanizing thoughts. It's not necessarily dehumanizing, but it could lead to it, right? Or do we think it's always dehumanizing?
Okay, so I mean, with the exception of like, I guess, like quoting
a book or a historical document, of course.
Yeah. With those exceptions, like, out of the way, let's pretend they don't exist. I would say that it is an inherently dehumanizing word, right? Because you cannot separate its historical, like, connotation and context with a word. They're not two separate things. And like, the word itself is a dehumanizing vehicle.
And you would agree with that, even if, or well, we're gonna say this is when, like, a person that doesn't belong to that marginalized group uses that word. So, like, when a white person says the N-word, right? Okay, so I'm curious. Let's say that you are doing a skit, okay, and part of that skit has a white person that says the N-word, but it's kind of supposed to make fun of the fact that that white person, you know, would use the N-word, that it makes them racist. And let's say that skit was written by a black person. Do you think in that context it would be okay for a white person to say the N-word? So we can say, like, an actor maybe that's part of, like, a movie, or maybe a comedian that's part of a skit that has, like, a black writer on it.
Okay. I'm going to preamble a little bit before I answer this question.
Sure.
So I think it's called Tropic Thunder.
Oh, yeah, Robert Downey Jr. is black, yeah.
Yeah. So you see, like, in that context, what happens is that the punchline is not the dehumanized group, right? The punchline is the person, right? And that's why I was, like, trying to say, like, in the exceptions, I would also include that, like, as an exception. Not
For
because
sure.
it's humor, but because it's basically, I guess, like, I don't want to say educational literature, but, like, it kind of is, like, a sort of literature, if that makes any sense.
Okay.
It's how do you call it? It's flipping kind of the script in the sense that instead of having, like, the black person or black people be the punchline, it's a racist man instead.
So I 1,000,000% agree with that take. So what I'm curious is, and I don't know if we can bridge the gap, and we can also agree to disagree at the end of this too. You don't have to, but, like, so that take that you just gave there about how, like, it flips the script, that's my argument for, like, forms of humor where, like, saying certain slurs could theoretically be acceptable. That, like, the point of whether a joke is dehumanizing or not doesn't really tie into whether or not there's a usage of a slur, but rather, like, well, what is the aim of a joke? Like, if the aim of a joke is to show that, like, okay, well, the person that used the slur is, like, a total idiot, and the fact that they even used the slur reinforces how stupid they are, and that's, like, the punchline kind of is, like, look at this dumbass. I feel like that's a form of, like, edgy humor that, like, makes using, like, a slur there acceptable. That's kind of, like, the argument that I have here, and then you can tell me, like, if you think or what the disconnect is there.
Okay, so I guess I have, like, a couple of questions, and you don't have to necessarily answer this. It's just, like, you know, if you feel comfortable, do it. If you don't do it. So when you make, like, those edgy jokes in private, are you using yourself as punchline?
I guess it would depend exactly on, like, what the joke was, I guess. I'm trying to think if I can think. It's really hard to think of examples because not only does it have to follow these standards, it has to be really funny. Otherwise, people will just say, like, well, then you shouldn't say it at all anyways. Well, here, okay, I won't use myself as an example. We'll use a South Park skit as an example, okay? So that have you seen the one with Randall or whatever? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I don't think so.
Okay, so there's like a Jeopardy episode, and he's on Wheel of Fortune, and the hint below is like people that annoy you, and then on the board, the board is showing N blank GGERS, and the guy asks Randall, well, what is the word? And he's very clearly uncomfortable, and he doesn't want to say anything, and he looks out to the audience, and I think one of the cameramen are black, and they like lean out and they look at him. And he's like, well, I don't think I should say it. And the guy's like, you have to. And then eventually he answers with the N-word. The answer was naggers, though, with an A. And then obviously fucked up. Like, that's like an example of like a joke where it's like, well, he knows that he messed up. He shouldn't have said it. It was dumb. It was offensive. But like, in order for the joke to work, like, it kind of has to happen that way. Otherwise, you don't really have that joke. So is something like that like an acceptable form of humor where like the joke there, you're not like... well, unless you believe it's intrinsically dehumanizing, you're not like dehumanizing black people with the joke in and of itself, and then you're utilizing a slur there to kind of like make fun of like the shockiness of that and then the dumbness of the person that used it.
Well, yeah, the point, like when jokes are used in that specific context, well, there's a couple of things to like, I guess, like break down here, right?
Sure.
The type that those the type of times you find those types of jokes are specifically like are in literature and in media where they're trying to make like an overall point about the subject, right? I would argue it's like very differently in private most of the time because like that setup isn't really there. Like usually when people use the N-word in private or use like racial slurs in private, they're not making fun of themselves or their whiteness or whatever. They're using black people in general as a punchline. So I think like that's the biggest distinction there.
Yeah, so this is something that I will agree with in public or private usage, right? So like for instance, if I had a friend and let's say that we were like let's say that we were driving by and there were like I don't know, like some Mexicans were like walking down the street or they were like sitting down somewhere and like a guy was just like, huh, lazy Mexicans, right? Or like lazy and then used a slur or whatever. Like that would be a part where I would be like, well, this isn't really like a joke or like using a slur in a good way. This is just being racist. Like this is not good. And the fact that you use a slur like in a way like made it worse. So like I would agree in cases where like the goal is literally to say like LOL, like I'm attacking like the marginalized group that the slur was created for, that's always a bad thing. There's never like a good or acceptable way kind of to do that or whatever. Or like you're literally using a slur to attack like a marginalized group of people.
Okay. Give me 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
I'm putting my thoughts together. So here's the thing. When it comes to like, I guess like the jokes that you're talking about or the comedy that you're trying to make, although I would argue like when it comes to like big platforms or whatever, like South Park or even things that aren't like comedic like that, like let's say you know, books like To Kill a Mockingbird or whatever, where the use of the N-word is trying to like kind of have like either flip the script or like Tropic Thunder, exactly, like flip the script, make the joke about the oppressor, not the oppressee. You know, I understand why in those forms of media it's used. However, that's like I'm trying to think about how to explain this best.
Sure.
When you do it, or when anybody really does it in private, right, with their friends, there is like, I would argue that most of the time that there is not that.
Or at the very least, we can say that there are times where people probably get it wrong, right? Where they make a joke where maybe they shouldn't have done it or whatever.
Yeah, or if you want to make a joke that flips the script like that, you know, it's what I'm going to argue is that it's completely possible for you to make those types of jokes without using the N-word. That I would argue don't even lose any comedic value. And you can do it in a way that basically kind of avoids any possible way of accidentally using dehumanizing language and reinforcing people's subconscious thoughts.
Yeah, but I feel like I guess it's just like when we get on that reinforcing people's subconscious thoughts, it feels like there are so many things that kind of have to be cut out completely, like if we go that route. So like, so you're familiar with the concept of satire, right?
Yes.
Like, I think like arguably all forms of satire that make fun of negative things in society, using this kind of like argument, essentially have to be completely deleted from our like our humor vocabulary. So this is, I'm working with like examples that I've like really commonly stated. So if you've heard it before, you can stop me. But like, have you seen like the It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia episode with the implication or whatever?
Yes.
Yeah, so like this is an example that I go to constantly. It feels like if we really believe that like implicit biases can form just based off of humor, even if we're like pretty clearly trying to satirize it, it seems like almost all of these types of TV shows would necessarily have to disappear. That we can no longer like have fun or joke about like these given topics, given the amount of not only implicit bias that can form, but the fact that these things still happen today in society. Is that like a concession that you were like willing to make? That you'd say like, yeah, fine, we should get rid of all of that?
I mean, no, I think I'm afraid that maybe I'm not like clearing myself up enough because like what all these things that you're describing are like foremost like public, right? There are public uses of, you know, of like there are public uses of slurs, or like for example, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, there is satire. They're making a satire out of like, you know, the kind of like the serious thing that happens in society. But again, and It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, what the whole show does is kind of, I guess, like flip those oppressive structures in a similar way, right? Here, the joke is not necessarily like, oh, women might get raped, right? The joke here is, oh my God, Dennis is such a fucking asshole, right?
Well, that's possible, though. It is possible because the problem is that It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It's not always clear sometimes, like, who you're supposed to be siding with or who you're supposed to be making fun of. So, like, when we take the Dennis character, for instance, there are times when he makes arguments that seem borderline sociopathic, and Mac is playing, like, the flip side, where it's like, okay, well, he's the voice of reason. But there are other times where Mac is playing the idiot.
Thank you, Jeff.
And not only is Dennis, like, the voice of reason, he's actually the voice of reason, and then everybody else turns against him. So, I mean, it seems like in those kinds of cases, it's actually not very clear. I mean, like, we can say it's clear because we know that you probably shouldn't rape women, right? That's something we can all agree on. But, like, it seems like there are a lot of cases where, at least in that show, you don't always know, like, who is 100% supposed to be in the right or not. For another common example, like, have you seen the science is a liar sometimes thing about, like...
Oh, I love that skit.
Yeah, but in that skit... not only is Mac the crazy one and Dennis the voice of reason, the other characters in that skit actually join with Mac at the end there, leaving as a viewer, right? Well, I don't know. Like from a production point of view, it's hard to say who we're supposed to side with. You know, we do because most of us believe in evolution, hopefully. But from like a writing point of view, it's not as clear. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I'd argue that you'd be right, in the sense that like, oh, if you're viewing It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia as like a whole series, and yeah, the characters switch roles, but usually like you can understand by just the context of the individual episode, right? Like,
I mean, I understand that, but like that's kind of my argument, right? You can understand that this is really horrible. Like, you know, you're not going to let this reinforce an implicit bias. But I mean, I would argue that like that kind of like science is a liar sometimes argument, that's literally used today by like anti-vaxxers, right? Like that's a thing that is pervasive. Like measles is coming back in America because people actually believe that stuff.
Well, there is two things to take into consideration here, right? When it comes to It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, you have like the presupposed context that, oh no, like this whole thing is like it's like satire of like real life. It's like making fun of different things that people like experience, and not just that, but like on top of that, the punchline is the characters themselves, like they're the joke. And the joke is like them thinking that like they're so cool, or them thinking that they can do all this stuff when really like they look like freaking idiots, right?
Sometimes they're like relatable, or they're nice to each other, like they're like balanced, or there's like Christmas episodes and stuff where they give each other gifts, or like where they try to help like that homeless guy or whatever. Like they're not always like absolutely horrible people. Like sometimes they're relatable and stuff, but
but like generally speaking, right?
Sometimes the only reason why I don't want to say generally speaking or always is because what I'm trying to show, or my argument, is that it does take some elevated cognitive process to realize, like, okay, well, this is not supposed to reinforce a bias. Like, this actually requires some kind of thought to engage with it. That, like, all satire requires you to be a little bit more critical of it or understanding of it than just watching something and laughing because it's, like, funny or true or whatever.
Yeah, but the point is that, like, you can't necessarily say the same thing about jokes that involve the N-word in private, right?
Well, why not, though?
Okay, this words are hard sometimes.
Yeah, that's fine.
So here you're saying, I'm gonna go back to It's Always Sunny before answering that question. And It's Always Sunny, you're saying like, oh, how come like there's no how come you're not worried about like the subconscious bias that plays in here, right?
Yeah.
And I would argue it's because It's Always Sunny makes it like abundantly clear who the real joke is, right? Like who the real punchline is.
Well,
even
who's
though
the
you say,
punchline in
"Oh,
the "It's always sunny sometimes"? Or I'm sorry, fuck. It's always science is a liar sometimes argument. Like, who's supposed to be the punchline there?
the punchline," I would argue that like what is it? Who is it? Mac?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mac, the one that was being like science is a bitch or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
and having like the rest of the characters like suddenly take his side because like they can't like kind of like argue or justify for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole punchline, right? It like subverts your expectations because like for the whole like almost entire series up to that point, everybody was like, oh my god, Mac is like a fucking idiot, like what is like a Jesus obsessed freak. And then in this one scene where
Mhm.
you expect like the same thing to happen again, your expectations are subverted, and it's
Well,
like,
so-
oh no.
So you say that, but I'm super curious. I'm sorry. Hey, well, hold on. If I ever cut you off, I'm sorry. Finish your thing.
No, it's okay. I was gonna just say like
Mhm.
the expectations are subverted, and that's why you get a laugh out of it. Because throughout the whole series, like you see it, you're expecting everybody to like dunk on Mac again,
Mhm.
and then they suddenly like switch their positions.
Okay. So like with that piece of media, I would argue that you could actually have very problematic engagement with it. And I'll give 2 examples. Imagine watching that scene and the 3 people that are your friends that you're watching it with are anti-vaxxers or people that don't think we landed on the moon. Or for a personal example that I would use, my family is very, very, very ardently religious, incredibly religious. If I was watching that episode with them, I think that they would laugh at it all the same as I would. They would find it incredibly entertaining, but they would find it entertaining because they would see that Mac was the champion, and the laughter would come from Dennis's frustrations and not being able to defend his crazy atheist arguments. That would be the joke then.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems like even for that media, there are very problematic ways that people could engage with it because they don't have they haven't already bought into the conclusion that we have when it comes to engaging with that form of media.
You know what? Like, I would definitely agree with you on that stance.
Mhm.
But then it goes back to the question of, like, okay, how does, like, the majority of people who view this media, like, interpret it, right? Or, like, who view these things interpret it. And I would argue that, like, when it comes to that, like, the majority of people who do watch, like, It's Always Sunny and, like, watch,
Mhm.
like, most of the seasons or whatever, have that sort of snarky, sarcastic humor where they do realize, like, oh, yeah, no, like, this is... whole subverting expectations is
Well, so
funny.
like, let's say we do that example, okay? So I'm gonna go look up the implications for It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. So when we look at like how the majority engages with it,
I mean, they also I would also argue like they make it abundantly clear like who the punchline is, just because like Mac's character is like dunking on Dennis during that like whole scene. He's like, "What do you mean the implication?" Like acting over.
yeah, for
like,
sure, yeah.
oh my
That's
God.
the goal that you get there. Fuck. Wait, did you guys change the YouTube comments when we looked at this last? I wonder if you fuckers did. When we watched this video last, one of the most upvoted, one of the most thumbs up comments that we saw here. Oh no, wait, I'm sorry, it wasn't this. It was. Do you remember the Dennis system?
Yes, I remember.
Okay.
The dentist.
So the joke in the Dennis system is that it's horrible. It's a horrible way to treat people, right?
Yeah.
Of course. But like the most upvoted comment in the Dennis system, if I look at the YouTube comment, and this is just by YouTube comments, this isn't like a scientific study or anything, right? But like the most upvoted comment there is, it's funny because it works. And like maybe that guy is memeing or joking or whatever, but
Maybe he's not.
yeah. And so like another good example of this type of humor, do you know who Chris Rock is? I don't know if it's...
I've heard of him, I think.
So Chris Rock is an older black comedian that he had one of his most famous like early skits was N-word with a soft A, but N-word versus black people. And he went through and he gave a bunch of examples about how like good, like that obviously he loves black people. He's black. He talks about like black family values and stuff. And he's, basically like, oh, like every time black people are trying to do cool shit, like some N-words show up and fuck it all up or whatever. And it's really bad. And initially, like it's a pretty funny skit. He really enjoyed doing it. It was one of his like most popular skits in the early days. I'm pretty sure he's on record now saying he regrets that skit because there are some people that engage with it in ways that he didn't want them to. That all of a sudden, like people took that skit and they were like, yeah, fuck N-words, even with like a soft A. And it's like, fuck, that wasn't the point I was trying to get across. So it just seems like there are examples of like, even if we focus on like really obvious stuff like the Dennis system or like the science is a liar sometimes, that we can both admit that there are people that we would be uncomfortable being around while watching that because they would unironically like believe what the person is saying. So then we have to start making, I guess, like the argument or your counter was like, well, the majority of people don't, right?
Yeah, no, but I actually, I agree with you in a lot in that sense. I guess it goes back to like the whole moral calculation stuff that you were talking about, right? Because the reason why I wouldn't be against taking away all satire, is because even though some people might take it literally, the whole point of like satire is like to point out kind of like ridiculous ideas, right? Or like do comedy, right? Like
yeah, for
making fun
sure.
of something and like bringing it up to the top. And by doing that, a lot of, kind of forces a lot of people to kind of think through, right? And to be like, well, do I hold that belief? Am I actually being that character that's being made fun of right now? But that's why it's like so freaking important what context it is, right? Or
Sure, but like then my question
that...
would be, in terms of how you just framed that engagement there, like why couldn't you do the same thing with like a personal joke among friends would be the question.
Yeah, that I was gonna get to that. Let me pre-ramble a little bit first before I get to that though.
Yeah, no problem.
So you see, like the whole point of like these works is that they're, first of all, as I said before, they're really public, right? So they get a very large audience. I would say enough to like kind of play the odds in their favor that like, oh yeah, like.
Well, but like I would argue, if anything, them being public actually hurts it more than that. Because when you say play the odds in your favor, what if Chris Rock had like 5 friends that he could tell that joke to? I think we could be reasonably certain that there would be less harm created than if he told that joke to everybody, right? Because now he can be reasonably sure he's telling it to, there's no bad effects. He doesn't have to wait.
It is, right?
But the what?
Like, it depends on like exactly what the skit is or what the...
Well, like in the N-words versus black people skit, that like this is something that he could just not say publicly at all. And then we started this off with you saying, I think, better to be safe than sorry, you said. It's like, it seems like you could just... Yeah.
I haven't, I kind of have trouble like arguing with you on that because I haven't like necessarily seen the skit.
Okay.
But even, taking what you're saying like at face value, that, yeah, that's created like more harm than good, blah, 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 blah.
Or even, it doesn't have to be more harm than good. It could just be a reasonable amount of harm, right? Like, let's say, for instance, I make a skit and 20% of people engage with it in a negative way. That's a sufficiently high level of harm, right? If 1 million people hear it, 200,000 become, like, blatantly more racist as a result. Like, or even if, like, 10% or even 5%, that's still, like, pretty large numbers for huge mainstream media, like, publication things, right?
Okay. I might be getting, like, a little bit confused here.
Sure, no problem. If you ever want to like write stuff down or ask me a question or refocus or whatever, you can do that. That's fine. That's totally fine.
Yeah, I don't want to like pivot or anything, but it's just like sometimes if I ask you a question relating to something else, it's just so I can connect it to this.
Sure. If you ever ask me a question, this is something that I do. Sometimes when I ask people a question, I have a notepad out and I'll write the question down. And then if in like 2 minutes we're talking about something totally fucking different, I'll ask them to like refocus. Like, okay, wait. Well, like, hold on. Let's just solve this question. So you can do that if you want. Like, write down the questions you have, or that's like a strategy that I use sometimes. I don't know if it would help or not, but
I'll keep that in mind. I might like type one down like soon.
Sure. Yeah, no problem.
We'll see. Yeah. Oh yeah. So here's the thing, right? Like, let's say my ideal or whatever is okay. Like, okay. You're talking about how you believe that if we follow through my logic about trying to be like better safe than sorry, then we could eventually get rid of all forms of satire.
Basically,
right?
Yeah. Or all forms of satire that have to deal with like off limits topics like racial humor, misogynistic stuff or whatever like that. Yeah.
But I think what is kind of ignored here is that satire is still like a form of change, right? It's still a way to like change people's minds.
It could be.
Yeah,
but I mean, it could also reinforce. It could reinforce their stereotypes as well, though. That's the whole point. It could do either. Yes. That's out of your control, right?
But the point is that satire, at least historically speaking, right, has, and in many cases, has been used as a successful form of change, right?
It could be,
yeah. There's a lot like. I could like find a list of examples of how it's been used as a positive form of change. And now you can argue that maybe with the internet things are a little bit different because now you can take a clip of a satire piece and put it in an echo chamber and nobody will know any better, right? But I'm just talking about like historically speaking, it was like let's throw it back all the way to like what, fuck it, all the way back to Socrates, right? Like. It has usually been used as like a successful form of change. So keeping that in mind, right? So it could be like a successful form of change. It would have to be public to begin with, right? And not just that, but most importantly, it usually highlights absurdity.
Generally, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious, like, or go ahead. It either highlights the absurdity of either
the norm or I guess like subverts the power structure.
Would you argue that, like, have you watched a lot of Family Guy?
Yeah.
So, like, would you okay, actually, so something I noticed I keep pivoting back to public forms, but you say there's a difference between public and private. So I'll stop doing that after this because I don't know if I'm pivoting too much there. So, like, would you argue that, like, humor like this is, like, okay, where, like, the joke is clearly that, like, if you're a minority, or it should be, if you're a minority, like, you're fucked, and if you're not a minority, you're okay, and, like, that's the joke, that's, like, not a good way to test people, but... Did you see what I linked? Oh, I linked you a picture on Discord.
Okay. I was like, I did the hacks, and now I'm figuring out how to undo the hacks.
The hack? Oh, for your webcam or whatever?
Yeah. Fuck. Okay,
oh, do you have it doing like a desktop capture and then you cut it out to... Oh, sure.
Yeah, I'll just check on my phone.
Sure.
Okay, yeah.
So, like, the joke here is supposed to be, like, making fun of races, right? So would you argue that... Okay, so let's try to focus in on this then. If I made a joke that was similar to this... if I made a joke that was similar to this in a private setting versus, like, in a public setting, like, is a joke like this in a private setting not okay, but in a public setting better or worse? Or what is that? Can you talk through that?
Okay, you're talking about that specific joke of okay, not okay.
Yeah, whether or not, like, the public or private distinction, like, matters here.
Okay. For this one in specific, and I haven't thought through this completely, right? So I might change my point of view if I, like, you know, when more points are brought up.
Sure.
But, like, from the top of my head, I would say, oof, that's hard. I don't think it's possible to make a joke like this in a private setting that doesn't, how do you call it? That doesn't turn out, like, kind of, like, racist or just, like, reinforcing negative stereotypes, right? Because the specific joke here is, like, it's not just okay, not okay in the terms of, like, colors, right? It's like, oh, TSA, border security or whatever, whenever they're, like, that's, like, the power structure in place. Whenever they're checking someone, they're racist about it, pretty much. You're like, if you're white, you're okay. If you're darker, you're not. So that's what it's making fun of. I have a very hard time seeing, like, a private joke where you're talking about okay, lighter skinned, not okay, darker skinned.
Okay. Can I give an example of... Okay. Oh, God. I said I would never do this, okay? So you're really lucky. I'm going to do this one time for you, okay? Are you ready? Okay. So I'm going to give an example of maybe a joke you could tell with the N-word in it in a private setting, and then you can tell me if something like this would, like, ever be acceptable, okay? Let's say that you're... Wait, hold on. Fuck. I have to think about this really carefully because if any joke I make, like, if it isn't funny or if there's even something remotely wrong with it, then it gets like crucified, like, super hard. Because I actually don't normally, like, make jokes with slurs them in the private. It's actually really, really rare that it happens. So I don't have, like, a lot of these, like, on hand. Use George Carlin. Well, I would imagine that you would probably be against, like, George Carlin using the N-word, right?
I don't know who George Carlin is.
Oh, fuck. Oh, no. I'm so old. Wait, George Carlin was even before my time, I guess. Oh, you should watch some of his skits. I think that's a pretty important person for this conversation. Not for this one in particular, but he was, like, he was a stand-up comedian who was white who used the N-word, like, pretty significantly. But he was also incredibly anti-racist, like, talked about, like, racist power structures, racist capitalist structures, like, racist corporations that kept down, like very, 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 like, avowedly. But used the N-word, like, publicly in his skits.
Yeah, but that's the thing that I'd be arguing here, right? Like, you can have a person who does all of that good stuff, but using the N-word, like, can still reinforce subconscious bias. And, like, that's just the thing. That's just, like, that's just how reality is, which sucks.
I guess I don't see how, like, if I'm telling the type of joke that could reinforce an implicit bias just because I use the slur, I feel like whatever joke that was going to be could just as easily reinforce the implicit bias like without using the slur.
Well, yeah, no, you're right, definitely. I guess it really depends on the exact context of the joke, right?
Well, kind of, but that's kind of my argument, right? At least for private usage, so that.
Yeah, but then it goes back to the whole thing of like, when it comes to private usage, like, yeah, no, like since you can't like mind read somebody's mind or like exactly know their history, even if they're like a close friend of yours, you don't exactly like know what their biases are or not, subconsciously, and that's the thing, like. And I, even though it's like a controversial statement, kind of, like, let's look at like the Donald Trump election. You don't have to believe he won because of racism, and I don't necessarily even believe he won because of that. Like I've talked about this in depth before. However, like after his election, right after he won, when you look at places he went to rally at, the amount of like hate crimes that happened there once he left like skyrocketed, right? They went like off the charts, and so has like general like hate crimes against like minorities have gone like higher and higher and higher ever since he's like taken office. So the point I'm trying to get here is that like even right, we wouldn't say like maybe like a couple of years ago or like when Obama was in office, people would be like, oh yeah, there's still racism in America, but you don't exactly know like how bad it is or how easily people have gotten radicalized or how much like it's increased ever since all these factors took place. So that's what I guess it goes back to the whole thing of like you like since you're a mind reader necessarily, even like if it's a friend that you trust, you can never be like 100% sure about what their subconscious biases are.
Yeah, but I mean, we have to have some reasonable levels of assuredness about what our friends think, right? Like we can't know about what they think about literally anything, but we have like a reasonable level of trust among our friends, right?
Yeah, but that's the thing. When it comes to like reasonable trust, there's plenty of jokes and there's like plenty of things that we can kid around with that don't involve like basically that don't involve the risk of keeping these power structures in place or like accidentally like reinforcing them.
Sure, but then I think you have to be careful of that one, because then I could just as easily turn that to shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia and say, well, there's tons of humor or jokes that don't involve like the dentist system, the exploitation of women, or science denialism, or rape culture. That there's like there's so many other things to joke about. Why would you have to like risk some people finding this humorous and then reinforcing those structures in people's minds?
Well, this is like where it goes back to like to the whole thing of like private like versus public, right? I'm not saying like this example is like 100% what happens all the time, right? But usually when it comes like to the private company of your friends, again, like you have like a deeper level of trust in them. So let's say you have like these subconscious biases or like these like feelings deep down, and your friend makes like a racist joke. Right? Like it might reinforce what you believe in, and you might feel more comfortable making those jokes back, or being like, well, my friend thinks this, and Bobby's a good guy, and me and Bobby are like really close. So if Bobby thinks that, it's okay if I think that, right? Well, when it comes to like, things like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, nobody thinks necessarily, or very, very, very few people think, oh, Dennis is a good guy. Mac is a good guy.
Do you think
Edie is a good guy, is a good girl, whatever? Do
you think because people have engaged with satire in irresponsible ways in the past, do you think that it maybe that argument isn't good? That maybe maybe there are people that watch It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia that actually do engage with the character Dennis in like very bad ways? I'm sure somebody in chat could think of somebody that was supposed to be like a satirical character that people like unironically hold up now. Oh, actually, maybe we can argue. Fuck, I actually don't remember this movie. It's been so long I've seen it. Have you ever seen Starship Troopers?
I have not.
Fuck.
But I have characters I can give you like for your argument, even though I'm stubborn, I don't want to. Rick and Morty. You can even say the Joker, right?
People are saying Rorschach. I don't know who the fuck that is. Fuck. Is that like a comic book person? Oh, wait. Have you ever seen the show Archer?
No. Tragic.
From Watchmen? Oh.
Oh, people in my chat aren't being rude to me. I'm so happy.
Yeah, nice.
No, I jump started that. Now they're gonna be mean.
I didn't watch Watchmen though. Okay, wait. What was the last point we were on?
Huh?
What was the last point you brought up? The last thing we were on?
I was saying that when it comes to like friendships, right?
Mm-hmm.
We tend to be like, oh yeah, like my friend Bobby's a good guy, and because Bobby's a good guy and he believes this,
Mm-hmm.
it's okay if I believe that, or if he's making jokes about that, it's okay if I make those jokes. While when it comes to satirical shows like It's Always Sunny,
Mm-hmm.
the vast majority of people can obviously see like, oh no, like Dennis is not a good person. Neither is Mac, nor is Dee Dee, nor is anybody here. And not just like, yeah, I would argue that there are definitely times where TV shows do uphold characters that they shouldn't.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I have a good example of it, like The Big Bang Theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
The Big Bang Theory had like there. I don't know if you've ever seen the video essay about it. It's called the Dorkable Misogyny of the Big Bang Theory.
Mm-hmm.
It's a very good video, and basically they show how this is like you know, like a shitty show because these characters are obviously like terrible people,
Mm-hmm.
but they sweep it under the rug and make it just seem like cute and like okay, and they're just being nerdy by doing these like terrible things.
Mm-hmm.
While It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia doesn't have that blanket over it, right? It's
I
not
guess
like,
it's just,
oh yeah.
it sounds like when you talk about like It's Always Sunny, it feels like this feels so qualitative, so it's really hard to like quantify this, but it feels like there's at some point there's some level where something is clearly satire and a level where it's not quite as obvious. So have you ever heard of the show called The Boondocks?
No.
So The Boondocks is a show that engages with a lot of like pretty edgy racial humor. However, I would argue that The Boondocks does it in a responsible way. Hold on one second. And the reason why I would say that it does it in a responsible way is because in that show, there is always a character that serves as your moral compass. There's the main character is Huey, right? I've been watching it so long. But in the Boondocks, there's a lot of like crazy, stupid, racist shit that goes on in that show. It's a cartoon, but the main character Huey is always like the moral, kind of like the moral microphone of the show, or megaphone, I guess. Like that's the one that you go back to. Okay, this is right, this is wrong. You know, Riley is like a young, I'm going to use the word thuggish, like stereotypical black guy. The grandpa does a lot of weird, like, you know, black people want free stuff. And like, there's like a lot of weird, you know, like black people that go to jail turn gay. There's like a lot of weird, like stereotypical stuff that happens in that show. And, you know, but at every point you can always go back to Huey and he'll give you like what the moral message is supposed to be. But I would argue that in shows like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I do think the message is a lot more vague. Now, maybe for you and me, we can say that it's obviously not vague, but I feel like that's not because of anything we get on screen. It's because we already come into it with our preconceived like biases. That like if I, for instance, I think I would be comfortable watching the Boondocks even with people that are kind of racist, because at the end of the day, Huey is 100% there. Like, this is what the moral message is supposed to be. If you miss it, you're so fucking racist you missed it. But with something like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, there are episodes where I don't think I'd be comfortable. Do you know what PUA is? Pickup artist shit?
Yeah.
Yeah, I wouldn't be comfortable watching that Dennis system clip in a room full of people that are PUA people, because I don't know, like, it's kind of hard to say. Like, in that scene, I think both characters... No, actually, in that scene, I think Mac is trying to learn from Dennis, and then the girl is the one that shows up and kind of makes fun of him for it, right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. So it seems like in those types of satire that, like, taking your argument, like, these can be pretty irresponsible. And actually, even without your argument, even with my argument, like, I would question the responsibility of things like this publicly. I feel like if we're going to say that me making a certain racial joke in public could, like, subconsciously influence some people in some ways, it seems like we would have to make that concession for It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Then almost every single one of those episodes could be subconsciously reinforcing some biases. It seems really hard to escape that, I guess.
I both agree and disagree with you, right?
Sure, go for it. I just talked a lot.
Yeah. So the thing is, like, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, I would argue that almost every single episode does have a character of reason, but it's usually like a character on the outside, right? So for example, there's like do you remember the episode of the high school reunion?
Nope, I haven't seen a lot of the episodes, so go for it.
Okay, so for example, in the episode of the high school reunion, we're seeing like how like their version of things, how they thought their high school was, and there's like this scene at the end which they're like, you know, where they're dancing like really coolly or whatever, and they're acting like they're the bomb, and then it cuts out, and you basically
I
see
just
it from
woke up
everybody else's
from a
perspective.
week-long
That's
coma.
just like
Did I miss
four like really drunk people dancing terribly, right? Do you remember the episodes with the lawyer?
No, I haven't seen a lot of episodes. There's only like one season where I've seen like most of the episodes out of. So sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so there's an episode with like basically you know, they get into like legal shenanigans or whatever, and in this episode like the lawyer is like kind of the voice of reason. And you know, I'd have to like rewatch the series a lot, but I think almost every single episode of It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia does have like, you know, a voice of reason within it. It's just never one of the main people on the crew.
Sure, but we can both probably acknowledge that there is some level of harm that show could cause by people engaging with it in an irresponsible way, right?
Yes.
So shouldn't we cancel stuff like that just to be safe?
Okay, I see where you're going with this. And then I guess like this is, and we might be like like at a crossroad or standstill or whatever. Because I would argue that like the amount of, I don't want to say enlightenment because I don't know what the right word is.
We can just say like utility.
Utilitarianism.
Well, it doesn't have to be utilitarianism. Utility could be a lot of even economists use the term utility, right? But like like the type of like goodness that we get out of it, whether it's humor or social change or just enjoyment or whatever, right?
Yeah, like the amount of like, you know, I guess like change it brings to the table is much greater than like the amount of like harm it possibly can cause. But that's specifically because it's public, ironically, right? Because it's public and it's because it's making fun of all these things that brings like so much like goodness to the table. But you can't say the same thing with private, right?
Well, but the public also makes it more harmful as well. So like I could tell that dentist system joke to 5 or 6 friends that I know like are good upstanding men in private and be okay, but I'm going to take a wild guess here, and I almost am positive I'm going to be correct. I'm willing to bet that there have been a number of women that have been raped by men that are using the dentist system unironically. Just because as a numbers game, I'm sure that's happened. That there have been some men out there that have unironically like tried that system and it's worked, because there are elements of truth to it. That's why it's funny, right? That have tried that system, it's worked, and they've actually managed to rape women as a result of it. I know that's happened just because of a numbers game, because of how popular the show is.
I would argue that like the psychology of a rapist, just because it's so complicated, would probably find a way to rape somebody using that system or not.
Well, but then my counter retort is going to be, well, I would argue that the psychology of a racist is going to be that they're going to find ways to be racist whether or not you use harmful jokes around them.
But that's the thing, like then it comes to the definition of racist, right? Which I think that's something that like a lot of people, especially in this conversation, like have like not like fully like I don't want to say understood. I don't know the right word for it, but well, basically that there's, you know, there's malicious and conscious racism, which is people who like, you know, just I believe black people are inferior and like there's nothing you can do to change my mind.
Yeah, and then there's like a more subversive kind of racism, right? Yes. But I would argue the exact same thing happens with rape culture. So like for instance, like there are men that are like, I'm gonna find this woman, I'm gonna fucking drug her, and I'm gonna fucking hold her down to rape her. But then there are also guys that are like, you know, I bet if I invite this girl over and it's like 12:30 at night, it's probably going to be too late for her to want to go home. The only place we really have to sleep is my bed. I bet I can get her to fuck me. Like, and that's rapey too. But like, I know that there are, but like that latter group of people, the people that aren't like, I hate women and I want to rape them all, but the people just have like kind of questionable like social views or approaches to sex that like implicitly take part in rape culture. It seems like those types of people could be susceptible to forms of satire that are supposed to make fun of them because they unironically don't see anything wrong with it. Like that thing that I just said, like that method of getting a woman to fuck you, it wouldn't surprise me if some like 25 to 50% of men in America thought that was like an okay way to get women to have sex with you. Like a lot of people think it's okay to get a woman to like, if she gets like really fucking drunk, not like blackout drunk, but like pretty wasted and then fucking them, that's like an okay way to do it, which I would argue is pretty comparable. Yeah,
no, that's absolutely true, and you're absolutely right about that. But I guess like when it goes back to the question of like, oh, is it okay to like do this in private? Then yeah, no, like that's the thing.
Well, but the argument for doing it in private is that, like, if I make, like, a certain type of rape culture joke with, like, 2 or 3 of my friends, and I know them, and we've talked about relationships and women, and I know, like, the ways that they approach women, the kinds of things they do, like, I feel more comfortable about that than making that joke in public, where just as a numbers game, and because it's satire, there are going to be people that will engage with it in a serious manner rather than in the satirical one that I intend. Because I lose control of the joke when I say it in a public setting. Sorry, go ahead.
But that's like, and I'm afraid, I'm sorry if I sound like a broken record.
No, that's fine.
But that's the thing. Like, you might think that these guys are like upstanding and great and like, you know, that they would never, like we've talked about like feminism before. There's no way that they'd really ever do something as like terrible as rape, right? So that's why it's okay to like make rape jokes around them, because they wouldn't do that. However, like, and I can find the studies for you later if you want. Like there's like a lot of research about how, oh no, like these jokes do normalize that sort of behavior, because it starts like changing your perception on that said act as instead of what.
But I know those same jokes are going to exist for misogynistic humor as well, which the dentist system is. It's a satire of misogynistic humor.
I'm sorry, I'm confused how you jumped from the previous sentence to the one you just said. Because when I was talking about private, I was saying like, oh yeah, like we know that that even if you think this person's okay and upstanding and great, there's like research talking about how these types of jokes, especially in private company that you trust, ends up like basically making light of rape and dehumanizing the rape victim and making her the punchline. While the dentist system, you're right, that some people will take the punchline as like, or not even, they won't even see the fucking punchline, right? They'll be like, oh, that's a good system.
Yeah, that's actually funny as fuck. Like, Dennis is a fucking bro, basically.
Yeah. But, you know, what I would argue is that, as a show as a whole and as an episode of the whole, Dennis himself is the punchline. Like, he gets made fun of, like, multiple times that episode.
Yeah, I agree. But, like, in the same way that privately, I probably know which of my friends are racist or sexist. I might not be perfect, though, because like you say, I can't know for sure. But we can agree that we can, like, reasonably, inductively figure out, like, who's racist or who's not to some percentage degree. So, for instance, like, if I know a guy that goes to KKK rallies and I know a guy that goes to civil rights marches, I probably can figure out, like, who's racist or who's not, even though neither one of those people are necessarily racist or necessarily not racist, right?
Yeah, but the whole point is that even if like you trust this friend, here, this is gonna sound like a pivot for a second, but hold on to me.
Sure. Or real quick, before you make this argument, just so you know what I'm about to like bring us back to is like you're gonna say, or what you were saying before is like, well, we can't know for sure, even if we're reasonably certain. But then I would say the same thing like publicly, like, well, how can you be reasonably certain that like there's not a large percentage of people that engage in a very negative manner with like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia? Because it seems like that's just as likely or possible, or if not more likely, because of the raw numbers involved.
You know what? Like I agree with you on that, but then I guess to me the question would come back as something of data, right? Like I would need to read like a study about exactly like how It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia like affects like people's perception in relation to the jokes they've made. Because like so far, like the reason why I hold this stance about like privately or whatever is because I've read like studies where the data does point to that, right? It does point to like dehumanization and
so like
reinforcing negative values.
Here, okay, do you want to finish your point?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, I would agree with you and make an argument that maybe It's Always Sunny is too dangerous, but I would have to read I would basically have to read a couple studies first that actually examine people's responses to that, right? Before I can make a true or negative statement of it. And this is like kind of off-related, kind of on-related. But that's like how when we were in the podcast talking, right? And people were like, oh, like what about BDSM? Like, isn't there like some subconscious like bias there that you might reinforce? And I didn't get to like explicitly say this, but there's actually been like multiple studies that talk about how, doing those types of acts or whatever, or the people who engage in those types of acts tend to have like clear communication skills outside of the bedroom, or tend to have like clear like set of boundaries, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Because that act itself is like, humanizing your partner, and even though it sounds like the opposite, but that's like another discussion.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
but then everything in terms of that, because that's probably because my guess is going to be like in BDSM communities, like the level of communication and trust required to participate in those acts is much greater than participating in just standard sexual acts, right?
Yeah. But that's what I guess like what I was trying to say when by bringing that up is that, like, you know, maybe like in a surface level thing, I would like agree, but once like I read the data and stuff, it was like, okay, no, like to me they're not comparable because of, like, you know, you have like these clear different effects that that if people who, let's say, participate in rape play were more likely to be rapists, they wouldn't have those types of I guess like positive effects. Does that make sense? Am I being clear?
Yeah, I kind of understand that. So, okay, so then one thing that seems to be like a crux of this argument is the data, like in terms of like what the data says. So yes. In most of the studies that I've seen, I'm going to say most, maybe it's 2, it seems like the question was really like, how do slurs, when there's no racist stuff at all, impact people's views? So something that I'd be curious, and you can shoot these towards me afterwards, and I'll read these actually, because I'm actually super curious, is, are there actually studies that look at how people's views change when racial messages are positive, are introduced, and then racial messages with slurs are introduced, and then contrast that with when jokes are made without slurs or without that type of environment, and then jokes are made that aren't racist or whatever with slurs or whatever? Because I feel like in some of the studies I've seen so far, so for instance, in the one that Cormandite talked about, his one showed that the audience was more likely to give a negative review to a black man after a debate performance when his performance was characterized using a slur, and then in the other one when his performance wasn't. But like I would argue that, well, that study shows that like if you're acting like unprovoked with racism towards a person, like in a serious setting, that like that's like obviously that's really bad, and I would never defend that, right? That if you're evaluating the debate performance of somebody and you use like a racial slur to describe their performance, that's horrible. So I'm really curious, and then like I said, you can shoot these towards me afterwards if you feel like you have like studies that show that among a group of people that at least are like that are tested, that hold no like explicit racial views, if their racism changes over time as a result of being exposed to this type of humor. That's something that I'd be super interested in, if that's actually like borne out like in a study or something.
I think I might have a study like that, but I don't want to say anything completely sure, because when I tell you like I'm a tab hoarder, like I have a million tabs open about this.
Yeah,
like,
I've got a Google Keep that I have like a fuck ton of stuff open in as well for stuff like that.
Yeah. But I guess like I don't know if you would take this as a yes or as a no or as like a valid point or whatever. I would. Oh wait, this is gonna sound really random.
Sure.
So you know how people, well, yeah, you know, like people like say that you are very good at de-radicalizing people. But the way that people get radicalized on the internet, they go into like these echo chambers that repeat like the same things over and over and over again, right?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. So I would like, you know, kind of like an extension of that. If a person who's like, let's say not explicitly racist, comes into contact with like these slurs and these jokes over and over and over again, with like very little, I guess like very little calling out, or very little people being like, oh no, that's not that way, or even like very little interaction with other people from that race that those slurs are being made out of, wouldn't it follow like logically that they'd have like, you know, a similar effect?
Yeah, 100% I believe so, of course.
Yeah.
So this is one of the things that I'm critical of, like when I go to 4chan, because I do think that you can use edgy humor without necessarily like taking on racial views. However, if you know somebody who like explicitly tells like anti-black or anti-Indian or anti-women jokes over and over and over again, like you have to wonder like, well, hold on, dude. Like it seems like you kind of believe this shit, because it doesn't seem like this is a joke to you. Like the punchline is literally like you hate these people. And 2, if you're around a person like that long enough and you're kind of like unwitting or unknowing and you start repeating a bunch of these fucking jokes without having the wherewithal to understand what you're saying, that you'll probably start to believe that some of that is like unironically true. Fuck, I wish I could remember, but there are certain stereotypes of people that I think get passed on. This is kind of sort of related, but like for instance, like the idea that gay people are kind of like shifty and creepy and weird was actually reinforced for a long time by Disney animated movies. Are you familiar with this at all?
No, but I love learning new things.
Yeah, so if you look at a lot of Disney animated movies, the main villain is usually portraying our understanding of what a gay man is. So if we look at people like Jafar, or if you look at like Scar in The Lion King, or if you look at like the mean guy in Mulan, the person that is the emperor's like not the emperor's like chancellor, whatever, that goes along with the guy. All of these people they're very emotive with their hands. They usually talk in a very eloquent way. They were saying, Ursula, in The Little Mermaid.
Based off a drag queen, I believe.
Yeah. That oftentimes like a bad guy is gay. Or has very gay characteristics that we understand in common society to be like kind of gay characteristics. And I do believe that engaging in that same type of derogatory humor over and over and over again, that's not necessarily humor, but like, that could definitely reinforce like negative stereotypes for sure. But I believe the same thing could also happen with satire as well, that it could be taken the wrong way and it could actually like reinforce like, bad things over and over again. But I'm uncomfortable saying we should get rid of all satire. I think more that we should find like more responsible ways to engage with it, I guess, is usually. Yeah, flamboyant might be the word I'm looking for, sorry. Maleficent, Scar, Gaston. Oh, sure, yeah. Okay, sorry, go ahead.
There was something I was going to say about... Oh, but then you see how this can apply to your friends, right? Because, like, even, I have friends that I'm extremely close to. I know, like, a lot of things about their personal life and their struggles. At the end of the day, like, despite how well I know them, and despite like how well you might think you know your friends and things like that, you don't know like what forums on the internet they're constantly on, or like what threads they're constantly on, or how much you don't even necessarily know how much interaction they have with minorities. Which
I agree. I agree with all of that, but like I just feel like that in private, the fact that I don't 100% know what my friends are, like I feel like all of this would apply even more publicly, and it would be even worse publicly because I lose control of who hears the message. So like I either have two options. I can either say like, well, I need to either be able to like explain to my friends, what my views are and make sure that they believe in them, that they're like relatively on the same page as me, or I need to just destroy that humor altogether in my vocabulary. But then that argument would apply in the exact same way in a public setting, that like in satire, we either need to say there are ways to engage with satire responsibly that make it an acceptable form of humor that doesn't dehumanize marginalized groups, or we need to just get rid of it altogether. And I feel like, that.
And I have a question for you.
Yeah, go for it.
So it, at least from what I've read, from what I've seen so far and stuff, then like kind of what like the conclusion I've kind of made, and that's like from the hot take of earlier, that if we completely get rid of this word, or if we completely stop using slurs like this, we'd probably like advance to like equal ground much quicker. Or like, we'd take down a lot of these like subconscious suppressive structures like a lot faster, right? So if like, wouldn't it make more sense? Like, wouldn't you believe then that we should get rid of these words in general?
I don't know if that's true, but if that was true, I would make a guess that like by getting rid of most forms of satire, it's possible that could follow as well. No?
I wouldn't say, because satire doesn't necessarily have to do with like racism, right?
Well, it doesn't have to, but like getting rid of like most forms of like racial satire or whatever.
Yes, yeah.
Which is just like to me, that seems like a pretty big like sacrifice, that to say that like all of these forms of humor like necessarily need to like be gone because they're not good. Can I pivot hard to the video game example I was going to give to Cormandite actually, and say I'm curious how you would engage with that?
Yeah, go for it.
So there was a huge meta-analysis done of 24 different studies. It had over 17,000 participants that basically showed like an undeniable link to aggression and video games. That it's like pretty well established in all of these. If let's say that hypothetically that came out to be true, that playing violent video games did lead to an increase in aggressive behavior, does that mean that like we should teach people to engage better with video games, or that video games should necessarily become or be considered like immoral as well, that violent video games should be considered immoral?
So here's a couple of things, and it might not sound related to the argument, but whatever. I just wanted to talk about it. So I read the study that you sent there, right? And there's only one thing that I kind of found a problem with. And it was that it never explained like how long these video games were played, right? So to me, like that like that. Maybe I'm wrong, right? If you find it and if you see that, like totally correct me. But when I was like looking over it, it really didn't say like on average or like how much like these video games are played, right? So
Sure.
to me, I just wondered like, okay, is there a difference between like 1 or 6 hours, right?
Yeah,
Because I would argue that.
I imagine there is probably a difference, sure, but go ahead.
Yeah, because I would argue that like if like there are these links to aggression, if a person plays violent video games 6 hours a day, like that wouldn't surprise me. And then my answer would just be like we should have like, you know, we should teach people to like, I guess like play responsibly with video games in the sense that you know, maybe 6 hours a day of shooting people or like shooting like virtual online people isn't the best thing to do, right?
Sure, but then like why wouldn't I just segue this into my argument and say, because actually what you're saying right now I kind of agree with, like video game stuff, or not video game stuff, with like slurs. If I was around a friend who made like racist jokes nonstop, I'd be pretty uncomfortable around that person because it would seem like they're, you know, kind of fucking racist. But like there's probably like, you know, if you make one like every now and then, like for me, like it's really really rare that like this kind of like super edgy joke or whatever is made either by me or like around me. Like it's pretty rare. But like that would be kind of be like my answer, that like, oh well yeah, sure, with like really edgy forms of humor you could probably like engage with it like just every now and then or whatever, like in a pretty rare example.
Yeah, well, I would actually like argue the opposite when it comes to jokes, right? The whole point of the joke is that it's supposed to be funny and like something like that, you know, best case scenario, you can like repeat to other people, even if those other people are just really close friends, because it's not acceptable in public, right? So like already you kind of have these like this presupposition when it comes to a joke, that when either whether it be with your close friends or just one other person, it's like funny enough that you want to like share and repeat. So that already like starts like a cycle of repetition that kind of goes out of your hands, right?
Well,
like,
yeah, but just like the video games, let's say you get into a video game, all your friends get into the video game as a result, but they only play for 1 hour a day. That's not necessarily bad, assuming that they still engage with it in a responsible manner, right?
Yeah, but the point is that at least when it comes to like a video game, you kind of have control over how long you play it, right? When it comes to your racist joke, you have no real control if your friend is going to repeat it to so-and-so or who and who.
Well,
that's
the same with a video game, right? Like, I can control how much I engage with a racist joke, but I can't control how my friends do. I can control how much I play a video game, but I might introduce a friend to League of Legends who becomes addicted to it, right? Like, it's the same argument, no? Or it's analogous?
Not exactly, right? Because the thing is, that joke might have not come into existence if you did not bring it up, or might have never reached their ears if you didn't bring it up. While video games, like, they have like a shit ton of marketing, a lot of it is word to mouth. Chances are
this not really, right? Like there are a lot of video game, or well, hold on. So this is my impression. Maybe this is different with other people, but there are a lot of people that exist on the internet. I'm using a really big wizard where there are a lot, but like it seems to be that a sizable chunk of gamers, I'll say 20% or more, literally only play games that their friends play. That there are like big Discord groups of people where it's like, yo, are you playing this? Okay, cool, I'm playing this. And like that's how they choose the games they play. So even though video games have a lot of marketing, if you don't have a group of friends that play those games, then you're never going to play them. So just by virtue of like suggesting a game to somebody, you could be adding a game to their vocabulary that they otherwise would have never ever really played, even though there's marketing. And also you could make the flip side for offensive jokes too, that maybe there's an offensive joke you could tell to somebody but you decide not to, but they could hear that offensive joke from somebody else, the same way that a marketed game could be just could be shown to a friend that you never show them personally anyways, right? So I feel like it's still analogous in that sense.
I don't maybe it's just something we'll agree to disagree with, but I really don't think they're proportional, right? Because same, like even the offensive jokes I would argue are like a lot rarer to come by, unless if you personally like, or I guess like purposely hang out in forums like that. What was something I was gonna say? Well, like, you know, video games, like a lot of people have started playing video games, or like, you know, make their friends online, right? Playing that game. So it's not like necessarily even you need friends beforehand. And especially when it's like huge franchises which are already like out of your direct control, like GTA 5 or like Call of Duty or whatever. Even if your friends like don't play it, that's not necessarily even going to stop you from playing it at all, right? Like it's just something like, oh yeah, I want to see how this is. And when it comes to like racist jokes or whatever, like you know, the same thing can't really be said, right? There's not multi-million dollar campaigns trying to convince you to play, not trying to convince you to make a racist joke, right?
I guess depending on how popular the joke is, but I don't know if I would agree with that either. So for instance, there was a huge marketing campaign behind Dave Chappelle's latest stand-up, but there were also jokes in there that a lot of people consider transphobic. So it seems like for some types of jokes, like even for those, like there are like, you know, big like multimedia campaigns, or like for certain movies that we might say are problematic.
I would argue like, okay, but then that comes to the other thing of like, being like a consumer of media versus like a participator in it, if that makes any sense.
Well, we're just talking about right now, like we're just talking about exposure right now, right? Like whether or not we can expose friends to something and it's like responsible or not. Yes,
but we also have to take into consideration like the difference between like an instigator and a consumer, right? So when you I'm trying to think about how to phrase this like the best way. When you instigate a racial joke, you risk the possibility that somebody from your friend group who's a consumer will then instigate said joke as well. Does that make sense? Does that sentence make sense?
Yep.
Dave Chappelle, I'd argue like it was also kind of like irresponsible. Dave Chappelle's like stand-up comedy bit or whatever, because it also runs the same risk when it comes to like the jokes that people thought were transphobic, right? That he instigated said jokes and people consume them and then instigate them throughout, right? Shit, I forgot where I was going with this exactly.
It seems we're trying to draw a distinction between like, because everything so far I feel I'm arguing is analogous, that you could share a racist joke to a friend, you could also share a violent video game to a friend, that big multimedia campaigns exist for racist jokes like Dave Chappelle's skits, and big multimedia campaigns exist for video games, like because video games or whatever. It just seems to me that like in the case like both of there's not like a meaningful distinction. Both of them have the potential to cause harm. Why do we want to ban like racist jokes but we don't want to ban playing video games, I guess?
I guess it goes back to the point that like what I was trying to like say earlier, right? That whether the thing about video games is that, especially since the meta-analysis didn't really like examine how long video games are played, we don't necessarily want to ban all violent video games, because there's a pretty like good possibility that maybe just like an hour or two of video gaming a day isn't gonna cause you to be more violent, right? At all, right?
But then we can also agree that like, I'm guessing, right, that like, I'm going to be extremely absurd here, but like one racist joke a year probably wouldn't make you more racist, right?
That's a thing I'm not completely sure of, right?
You think a single racist joke?
Let me clarify.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Because the thing is like, if we're talking in practical terms, right? Like the chances of one single racist joke or whatever, to be like, okay, there's two things I'm going to examine here, right? Chances are like maybe that one racist joke a year is confirming all your like, or is confirming like subconscious biases or whatever that you gain, not even from racist jokes, right? From like racist media or stereotypes or whatever, or things like before that, right? So just like let's say one racist joke a year can still like reinforce those biases that you got from way beforehand from other stuff, right? Now take that, like, also like I guess we're talking about practicality versus idealism, right? Which is like, yeah, maybe in this theoretical world you only get a racist joke once every year and like that's it, but in reality, like the chances of that are like so freaking slim, right? If you're hanging out with like a group who like kind of like does like racist edgy jokes, chances are you're not just going to hear it once. And not just that, but you're probably going to find it also like online or similar things online in the same vein. And at first, even though you might just like laugh because like, shock value, eventually like once you come into like enough exposure with it, you're going to start like actually thinking like, maybe this is true.
Sure. Okay, so I'm going to continue on and I'm going to argue that it feels like it's still perfectly analogous to the video game example. That if video games did lead to an increase in aggression, it's possible that like just playing one video game might be the thing that like pushes you over or reinforces some implicit bias or whatever, or encourages you to do something that maybe you otherwise wouldn't.
Sorry for interrupting, but that's why I would say like it all depends on the data, right? Because like at least from the data I've read, like even though it doesn't go as like simple as one joke, but that's because like that's not very like a practical way of like looking at like how often jokes happen.
Yeah, well, that was like the second part too, is that like that's not practical. I would argue it's not practical to introduce some video games to people and expect that they'll only play 1 hour a day. That's like super not practical as well. That most people don't engage with the medium that way.
I'd agree with you, but then it goes back to like getting stuck on the data, right? Because the whole meta-analysis that you gave me and I read never gave like an average of how much video games a day you'd have to play or how long you'd have to be playing for you to start becoming like more aggressive, right? Because then like if it turned out that participating like 5, 6, 7 hours in a video game does make you more aggressive, I would definitely argue that, oh yeah, we should try to limit how much we play aggressive video games. But the reason why nobody's advocating for like a ban on violent video games, I would say, is because that line isn't clear and it hasn't really been like distinguished. And even though there's data that supports like the supposed violence of supposed violence after playing video games, because it's not clear whether it be 5 minutes or a ridiculous amount of time, like 8 hours, it's not fair to make like that blanket statement. Meanwhile, when it comes to like, subconscious biases, when it comes to like racial jokes, there's a lot of data that talks about like how even these like small actions can lead us to do racist consequences without us even realizing it, without us even like thinking about it, even if we think we're super not racist and even if we think we're an ally,
Sure, okay. I guess that then it'll just come down to me like maybe that's the difference is the empirical part there that we would have to look at.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wait, so did we reach a impasse, I guess?
Yeah, so the impasse is going to be that like I think that if you showed me a study that showed that like even a few racial slurs can cause people that are otherwise like completely not racist to start to and have racial thoughts or whatever that like manifest like in a real way, that I would have to like reconsider my position, it seems.
Okay.
So it'll come down to like looking at like that kind of empirical data or whatever.
This wasn't as scary as I thought I'd be. I was so nervous about talking about this.
Yeah, no problem.
Yeah, no, I enjoyed this conversation a lot. Do you have any questions for me, I guess? I don't really know how, like, this is my first time doing this.
No, I think we're good.
We're okie dokie, artichoke?
Yep.
Okay, I hope you have a good day. Thank you so much for discussing this with me.
Yeah.
I appreciated our combo.
No problem. Thanks for the conversation.
Bye.
Bye.
What do I... Wow. Okay, I'm kind of stuck.
You got it?
No, I don't. Wait, why won't it do it? I can't see the end call button. Oh my god. Okay, I think I figured it out. Okay. Maybe I'm just stupid.
You can do it.
Oh, found it. Okay, bye.
All right, bye. All right, good job, guys. Wow, we got through a whole conversation that was actually one of the best like structured conversations I think I've actually had in my entire life. Funny enough, I had really, well, I don't want to say I had low expectations, like I think she's an idiot, but I didn't have like high expectations for that conversation, but I don't fucking know. Like, it seems like we're taking pretty real steps, like we're banning Muslim majority countries. We're fucking putting like kids and training them to